for this last lecture. And today I'm going to discuss social stratification. And in keeping with the idea of the sort of model of the sociological imagination, I want to take a look at two events that occurred in over the last week or so, and that is the Liberal Party convention and the New Democratic Party convention that were recently held online. In Canada, in case my experience is that, anyway, in Canada, the federal government, the Canadian government, the Canadian Constitution, let me start over. The Canadian Constitution has organizes to a great degree political politics in Canada, and Canada has a federal constitution, which means, for our purposes anyway, that there are two different autonomous levels of government that regulate law in Canada. There's a federal government and there are provincial and territorial governments. And the Canadian Constitution divides up the areas of jurisdiction between those two levels of government. And often, but not always, certainly, when the media talks about government, they mean the federal government. And so I will be using documents that were produced by two of the three major parties, the two parties that in the last week held national conventions for the party members of on the one hand, the Liberal Party, and on the other hand, the NDP. And part of my reason for calling this to your attention is to demonstrate to you that social stratification is a concern for these two organizations, the Liberal Party and the NDP. Social stratification is also a concern for the Conservative Party, but I only have a limited amount of time. The Conservative Party platform, at least as it's available online, is not as easy for me to use in this context. And so, although in fact it reflects my own ideological orientation, and so there might be some unconscious thing going on here, but by and large, I've chosen the NDP and the Liberals convention mostly because it was just held and it's still in the news, but also because it's a little bit more convenient from a presentation point of view. They both passed resolutions on a similar topic dealing with social stratification, but the differences in how that policy resolution is presented allow us to observe the contrast between the conflict theory version of social stratification and class relations on the one hand, and the structural functionalist view on the other. And so for that reason, I want to turn and take a look a little bit more carefully at the two responses that these two parties presented to their members. But before I turn to that, I want to briefly, I hope, describe a little bit the significance, the sociological significance of taking a look at what political parties are doing, and to distinguish, firstly, from a terminological point of view, and then secondly, from an institutional point of view, the role of parties in Canada. And just to orient us to the readings that I've already assigned, Weber argued, and Turner, I think, did a pretty good job given the limited amount of space that he provided himself with in that reading. Weber's compromise, his allegedly midway theoretically midway between structural functionalism on the one hand, and conflict theory on the other. Weber stressed that political parties are a socially institutionalized mechanism that mediates between the effect of wealth on the organization of society and other forms of power in society. And so Weber argued that political parties are an important component in understanding how power is created, produced, reproduced, distributed in modern societies. And so here we have two different political parties concerned with, so the purpose. Well, what do you think the purpose of a national convention is for a political party? Why would the Liberal Party and the NDP hold conventions like this? What would they be trying to accomplish, do you think? Well, what do political parties do? Okay, thank you, Fatima. Yes, so political parties, uh, one of the things political parties do is they present candidates at elections. And so let's just take a look. Just one second here. Do you see a chart on screen, like a table? Is that on the screen now? Oh, no. Okay. Is it on the screen now? Okay, thank you. So at the bottom of the screen, what we have here are the website is from the the official House of Commons website, and it's a list of the current composition of the Canadian federal government. And so so there's a total of 338 seats in Parliament. There are 5 independent members of Parliament. That is, they're currently no longer members of any political party. I'm pretty sure all 5 were kicked out of different parties, but I'm not 100% sure of that. Several of them I am sure about, but not all 5. There are 3 members of the Green Party, 24 members of the NDP, 32 members of the Bloc Québécois, 120 members for the Conservative Party of Canada, and 154 members of the Liberal Party. Now, those of you who are good at math will be able to tell right away 154 is less than half of this number. What's the significance of that? Why is that significant? Well, I know you know this. The significance of that is that votes that are taken in Parliament operate on the basis of a majority. And so any motion proposed in Parliament, in the House of Commons, is passed when more people vote for it than vote against it. And over the course of Canadian history, most parliaments, most Canadian elections resulted in one party gaining more than half of the seats. And the consequence of that is that on any particular motion, the party that forms the government is ensured that it will be able to pass the bills that it puts forward because it has more members than the total of all the other parties combined. But in 2021, in the current setup, if all of the other parties agree, then they can defeat any motion that's put forward by the Liberal Party. And so in a minority situation, the dynamic, the way that the latitude that the government party has is narrower than it is in a majority situation. And again, over the course of Canadian history, minority parliaments don't last as long. They're less likely. So the length of time that they stay in power is shorter than the average length of a majority government. The government party gets to call the election, or the other parties can force an election. I don't want to go too far down in the details of how this works, but all three major parties, that is the Liberal Party and the NDP in the last couple of weeks, and about almost a month before that, the Conservative Party, all had conventions recently. And that is by and large because everyone expects that there's going to be a federal election either later this spring, or if not this spring, then early in the fall of this year. And in order to position themselves to gain electoral advantage, the parties get together, and on the one hand, they want to mobilize, they want to energize their own members and their own volunteers. They want to raise money in order to pay for the advertising that is in the modern world, in the contemporary world, an important consideration for all these political parties. But essentially what they're doing is exactly what Fatima said. Let me just get it exactly as she said, to gain voters for the next election. So I want to turn now to take a look at the details of these particular propositions. And to demonstrate to you the truth of my claim that the Liberal Party and the NDP, at least, and we're not going to have the opportunity today to take a look at what the Conservative Party is proposing, but the Liberal Party and the NDP are both considered resolutions in favor of establishing a universal basic income in Canada. So let's just take a look at what that says. So now let me make this big enough so I can read it. So the fifth resolution in the Liberal Party's policy book is, it's not called that, I forget what the exact title is, A Canadian Basic Income, Rethinking Canada's Tomorrow. And so the resolutions at these conventions are typically organized, well, they're all organized this way. The people who are credentialed, the people, the members of the party have the ability to present resolutions that the assembled party then votes on. And if a majority of the members present vote yes, then the resolution is adopted as part of the party's official position, and in our current context would then become part of the election platform. And so here we have a series of whereases. These are the premises on the basis of which the assembled people are being asked to consider the resolution itself. And I want to take a look at both because it's the premises and the resolution itself that will allow us to distinguish between what I'm arguing is a structural functionalist understanding of stratification in Canadian society versus a conflict theory approach to and understanding of and response to stratification in Canadian society. And so we get, whereas COVID exposed serious gaps in the federal and provincial social safety nets. The second one, whereas economic stability is key to equality of opportunity and dignity, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states everyone has a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of themselves and their families. What was the other part? Whereas several basic income experiments have both shown positive results and debunked labor force concerns. I want to return to that. Be it resolved that the Liberal Party of Canada urges the Government of Canada to conduct a basic income cost benefits analysis, including reviews of basic income projects and studies by subject matter experts. Explore streamlining current federal income supports while maintaining those for distinct needs. And finally, work with provinces, territories, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit to develop and implement a basic income guarantee. Now, I want to compare that to the NDP version of the same thing. In the NDP policy version of it, they go their whereases, and then part of the explanation here is a kind of administrative decision that the NDP took that's different from the one the Liberals took. The NDP pre-convention package asked the members to limit the number of whereases they include in their policy proposals. So that's partly why there are fewer whereases. Anyway, in this one, fighting poverty with guaranteed basic income. Whereas millions of Canadians live in poverty, increasing risks for mental and physical health problems and homelessness. And whereas Canada's guaranteed basic income for Canadians over 65 has produced a laudably low rate of elder poverty, and whereas existing social welfare programs are complex and do not protect all Canadians, be it resolved that the following clause be added to the NDP policy book. Supporting and working toward the implementation of a progressive guaranteed basic income system in Canada, which maintains existing levels of publicly funded social supports. So the contrast between these two, the Liberal Party proposal for guaranteed basic income takes a, roughly speaking, structural functionalist approach to stratification in Canadian society. And the Liberal Party is proposing a basic income for the purpose of stabilizing the current situation. The idea is that the problem that basic income is intended to resolve is the instability caused by income inequality, by wealth inequality. The NDP, on the other hand, are proposing that they're proposing, roughly speaking, in a very mild, from my point of view anyway, a mild version of the class conflict understanding of what's going on. The NDP is saying poverty's wrong. Poverty is bad for poor people, and the NDP is proposing a policy that will repair poverty for the benefit of the poor, not for the benefit of the rich, not in terms of problems for the rich. Rather, the problems that are being fixed are the problems of the poor. Now, does that seem like an accurate description of the contrast between the two policies? Let's go back to the Liberal Party one, just so I can highlight a couple of features. So they explicitly state that economic stability is one of the reasons to propose a basic income. So this is the Liberal Party one. And they argue that a basic income would simplify, would allow the merging of government programs and reduce costs for government. So the Liberals want to stress that, which is so a basic income is a fairly well studied policy proposal characteristic of social scientific approaches to issues in the modern welfare state in for the last 50 years. This is not a brand new idea. It's not even a brand new idea in Canada. And there's quite a bit of research that's been done on it. The Liberal proposal here, though, argues that, and so part of the logic behind a basic income is that it's intended to be implemented in a way. In some places, it's explicitly introduced as a cost-neutral proposal. The basic income gets introduced, but other income supports get subtracted. So how exactly it would be applied is not explicitly detailed in either of the Liberal or the NDP policy proposals. It is an emphasis between the way the Liberal Party is presenting the policy and the way the NDP is presenting the policy. And so here. Now the last one I want to consider that I didn't follow either of the conventions, so I didn't listen to, and I'm not a member of either of these parties, but I am familiar with what the labor force concerns are. What do you think the labor force concerns might refer to in this whereas? What could be labor force concerns around a basic income, a universal basic income? Well, first of all, do you know what is a universal basic income? I suppose I should have started with that. Thank you, Rebecca. A universal basic income is an income that would be provided to everybody in Canada, every adult in Canada, below a certain level threshold of income. So I wouldn't get. I mean, if I keep my job, as long as I still have this job, I wouldn't qualify for a basic income. And depending on how it's implemented, nobody who has a full-time job would qualify for the basic income. It would be exclusively available to Canadians whose income is below a certain threshold. What do you think of that policy? What would be the advantages and disadvantages to Canadian society overall? Just so you understand what's being proposed here by the Liberals and by the NDP, some of your tax money would go to pay for people who don't have a job. They don't have a job, and they would get money that would come from, in part, the money you pay from your job in income tax, and the money that's added to the tax money that's added to your purchases of goods and services, and mine and everybody, right? In Canada, that is. There's very good evidence that, in fact, it would reduce the income inequality gap. And so it's clear who benefits from, in the short term anyway, it's clear who benefits from this. Poor people benefit from this, and rich people don't immediately benefit for it. Rich people, and in fact, the large majority of Canadians would not qualify for this. By large majority, I mean statistically speaking, depending on where they set the minimum threshold, the cutoff, there would be, most people don't qualify for this. Does it seem to you, what are some of the possible downsides to this? Are there any possible downsides to this? So explain what you mean by people would try to take advantage of the system. Why shouldn't everyone take advantage of the system? Isn't that what a system is put in place for, so that people take advantage of it? Okay, so that's exactly what this particular whereas, the last whereas, is included. Several basic income experiments have both shown positive results and debunked labor force concerns. One of the main initial concerns raised by people who are opposed to proposals like this is that if you provide a minimal basic income support, why would people go to work? What reason would people have to show up to work if they could stay home and get that money? Well, the answer for a number of people, so for example, in my case, my salary pays me a lot more than what the basic minimum, but the basic income would, and I wouldn't be able to live the life I'm living right now. I wouldn't be able to pay my mortgage and all my expenses, and save money for my retirement and so on, if I quit my job and simply lived on the basic income support. So for me, the trade-off just on that level is crystal clear. I'm not going to quit my job and just get this money. And there might be if the basic income was $100,000 a year, anybody who, if they provided $100,000 a year for the basic income, maybe I would quit my job and just take that 100 grand in order to be able to keep doing all the things I like doing. But that's not what anybody's proposing. They're not proposing it at $100,000. I think it's something like $24,000 a year. Ontario, the previous provincial government in Ontario implemented a pilot project in, I think it was 3 or 4 communities in Ontario, in order to determine what the pros and cons were, not in theory, but in practice, in effect. Given what we've already taken a look at this semester, what would you expect might be some of the advantages that a program like this would generate? So let's leave to the side for a minute the possibility that people who shouldn't qualify would qualify. What advantages do you think would accrue to the individuals involved and to society overall if such a program was implemented? Well, there's 2 areas where the evidence is basically crystal clear, and that has to do with education and with health. Poverty makes it more difficult for students, for young students, to succeed as well in their education, to achieve at the same level, to achieve over time, to translate their efforts in class to longer term learning. And by giving more money to poor families, the evidence is very clear. Learning outcomes are improved for those children. Learning outcomes are improved also for high school students who live in poor families, and for post-secondary students. The basic income would allow people who otherwise wouldn't be able to go to college and university to go to college and university. So that's an advantage to the individuals whose learning outcomes would improve. Now, how does that, or does that translate to an overall advantage to Canadian society? The claim here is not, the Liberal claim anyway, is that the justification for this is that it's good for all Canadians. And it's because it's good for all Canadians that they're considering it. How do all Canadians benefit from learning outcomes in grade 1, grade 2, grade 9, grade 10, and post-secondary? How do improvements in education benefit all Canadians? Assuming it's true, for the sake of argument, that basic income would produce that, how do all Canadians benefit from this? How is that an argument in favor? How is that an argument for all Canadians, Canadians who aren't poor, to endorse this? Because what they're asking for is a redistribution of wealth from wealthy people to poor people on the basis of advantages to everybody. That's the structural functionalist claim. Roughly speaking, why should selfish rich people agree to having some of their money go to poor children? How in particular does improved learning outcomes in grade 1, in grade 9, and in college benefit rich people? I mean, it's the same reason that elementary school and high school is paid for by our taxes and is more or less free, and why colleges and universities are subsidized to the extent that they are by tax dollars also. There are no countries in the world where, well, that's perhaps not true. There are very few countries in the world where elementary education at some level is not provided by for free. And in Canada, it's been a long, long time since high school and elementary school were paid for by taxes on everybody. So just to review the question, why would rich people, so the Liberal Party is looking to, as Fatima pointed out early on, the Liberal Party is putting forward these propositions in order to get votes from Canadians. It's pretty clear how poor people benefit from this kind of policy, and so the appeal of this policy to poor people is not difficult to understand. The appeal to rich people is not immediately obvious. I think that it's crystal clear in the interest of rich people to support this, middle class people, let's say, middle class, upper middle class people, to support this policy. What arguments can you think of would lead selfish middle class people to support this, or what self-interested arguments are available? It doesn't even have to be understood in terms of a moral category, in terms of a sociological category. What advantages accrue to middle class people by improving the education system? The claim is basic income would improve the learning outcomes. How does that improvement benefit middle class people and upper class people? Socioeconomically speaking, upper class people. Well, why do we have a public education system? How does the public education system in the first place benefit all of Canada? Well, the short answer from a structural functionalist point of view is that there is overwhelming evidence that a more highly educated workforce is more productive, and therefore the people who own the businesses, the rich people, benefit by having educated workers. And it's much less expensive if the costs of educating everybody is distributed across the whole population than it would be for the potential for employers to have to somehow provide for the education of their future workers. They don't know. There's no way for a current employer to be able to know who in 20 years from now, whose education they'd have to pay for 10, 15 years in order to have those people available to them to work in 10 or 15 years. And so the public education system benefits everybody in society to the degree that it makes the Canadian economy more productive. And so the very wealthy who own businesses benefit by having well-trained employees who generate revenue for their businesses. The rest of us who work in that system benefit from a more highly educated population, because by participating in that economy, it improves our standard of living, even when we don't own, even when we don't have shares in these companies, even when our wealth isn't directly increased by the increased productivity of the economy, our standard of living is raised overall, and our wages typically follow the increased productivity. That's a bit more complicated, the degree to which the wages follow, and it doesn't follow equally across the full range of wages in any capitalist economy. Nonetheless, the standard of living has gone up, basically in all countries where there's more education, the standard of living increases. The second area is in health. And here it's even more clear the connection between basic income and health outcomes. Basic income, decreasing the level of poverty in families decreases the amount of money it costs to operate a healthcare system. And so the advantage to everybody in Canada for a basic income is that it frees up resource. Ultimately, in the long run, it frees up, it makes available resources that are otherwise taken up by providing health care for the negative health outcomes over a lifetime of children growing up in poverty. One of the drivers of a basic income program is that it serves to diminish the extent to which children born into poverty continue over the course of their life to carry with them the social disadvantages that are the consequence at a society level. So when you take a look at all poor people in any given society, we know that their learning outcomes are lower, and we know that their health outcomes are poorer, are not as good compared to other socioeconomic groups in that society, and it tracks in a relatively linear manner. So the richer you are, the better your learning outcomes are. The richer you are, the better your health outcomes are, roughly speaking. And below a certain minimal threshold, there's an even stronger than linear connection. And so the idea of a basic income, from the point of view of society overall, from the structural functionalist point of view, is that it's less expensive in the long run in terms of the operation of a society like ours that depends for its survival on sustained economic growth at a certain threshold. It's less expensive for us to divert some of the surplus value generated by our society to a basic income proposal than it is to downstream from the negative consequences of wealth inequality to pay for those to pay for the negative consequences. And so we get here we get an example of a structural functionalist approach to a particular problem. And that structural functionalist approach is framed in terms that Fatima pointed out at the very beginning. The Liberal Party is looking for votes from some groups of people, for a number of groups of people. The NDP instead is proposing the same policy on the basis of a different kind of argument. The NDP is not foregrounding these what are described as debunked labor force concerns. The Liberals are highlighting, they're acknowledging that there are labor force concerns, but what they're claiming is that sociological, social scientific results, basic income experiments, have shown that these labor force concerns are invalid. What they're talking about here is that in almost all of the places where these basic income experiments have been implemented, or even just the basic income components have been implemented, overwhelmingly people still prefer to get paying jobs to not having paying jobs and accepting the basic and living on the basic income alone. It turns out that for whatever reason, people are motivated to work for a living by and large in the modern world. The result of all of the combined social pressures that exist on us, conscious and unconscious, including rational decision making about the prospects of more money coming in as a result of a job, as opposed to less money coming in as a result of a basic income. All of these things combined have demonstrably produced situations where people who start out with basic incomes, they use that basic income to improve their relative position in the labor market, and they transition from being recipients of basic income, they transition out of that into participating in the labor market. Now, the basic income would be available, and in all of the different iterations of it, basic incomes are also being suggested for people who, for whatever reason, don't have a place in the labor market. So, among other things, different kinds of disability mean that some people are unable to fully participate in the labor market. And those people are currently, by and large anyway, being supported anyway. Another component of the basic income is that at the levels that are being proposed, all of that money gets pushed back into the economy anyway. The amount of money that's available on a basic income, much of it gets, basically all of it gets chewed up by rent, food, and other living expenses. And so that money works its way through the government interface, where it generates, partly that money goes to pay the salaries of the government that's operating anyway. Plus, it pays for the living expenses of all of these people. And so they spend their money in the community, and that money goes back into the community, pays for the wages of the services and goods that are purchased by the people living on these basic income experiments. And so the logic of these kinds of programs is that it's a so-called win-win proposition. The tax money that's diverted to pay for these programs re-enters into the economy through, part of it through the expenses that are incurred by the recipients of the basic income experiment, of the basic income, and secondarily through the wages that are earned by the government workers who are administering these programs. They also, while they're at a higher level of income, typically ranging from the frontline government workers who have good salaries in Canada for sure, relative to the average salary structure in Canada, all the way up to the Prime Minister, who has a very good salary relative to the average salary structure. All of that money, the basic income experiment includes wages for the government, tax money, but that money also goes back into the economy. And so the structural functionalist argument is that everybody gains overall from this, and that it stabilizes the current system. In contrast, I'm going to wrap up with this. In contrast, the NDP is asking its potential voters to support this program because it fixes the reality of poverty. It alleviates the negative consequences of poverty for the millions of Canadians who are already living in poverty. Now, it doesn't automatically follow from that that consideration is absent from NDP voters. NDP voters have their own reasons for, or potential voters anyway, have their own reasons for wanting to fix the reality of millions of Canadians living in poverty. Nonetheless, the difference between the nature of the proposal from the party to the potential voters, I think, is clear on the face of it. Okay, so that's it for today and for the semester. So have a good rest of the semester, and I look forward to hopefully teaching you in the fall in Sociology 291. And if it is online, there are going to be a number of changes. Among other things, Ultra Collaborate won't be available anymore. So we'll be holding our online sessions in Zoom, and stay tuned for some of the differences between how the course has been organized this semester and how it will be organized if we're still online in the fall. Okay, thank you very much, and I will talk to you perhaps in the fall. Okay, thank you.